G'day, mate. Luke Ford here, and I don't think many of you realize the burden of charisma. Do you really understand the burdens that I operate under here? Like when God gave me these gifts, when He gave me the power of charisma, when He gave me the capacity to essentially like send lightning bolts out through my eyes, affecting tens of thousands of people who are probably tuning in right now. I didn't realize about the burden of that. I mean, to think that just if I just look, people who are probably look askance, say, at some pronouncement by the World Health Organization, then you guys are going to follow its precepts for how to deal with this COVID-19, this coronavirus, this China virus. I mean, that's the amount of power that I have, and that's precisely why YouTube is so afraid of me that they are just forced to shadow ban me, because there's just so much power. That's the amount of and charisma just rocketing from this show. Like the things we do here, it just completely revolutionizes people's thinking. And you may think, oh, I'd give anything for this dark power, this ability to mesmerize the masses. There are probably tens of thousands of people watching this video right now, and you think, oh, I want that kind of influence, but it's a burden, because I know if I smile, hundreds of teenage girls will not just start smiling, they will start laughing uncontrollably and dancing for hours on end, and all I have to do is smile. That's the effect that I have. You should see my ratings with 14 to 17-year-old girls. They're just like off the charts. It's just unbelievable. So I have to use these powers only for the good. I don't want to distort any of your veneration for our elites. I know just if I just raise my eyebrow a tad, it's going to completely warp your understanding of our leaders, social distancing guidelines, the World Health Organization, the precepts passed down to us by the CDC and CNN, and so it's a burden. What can I say? And there's someone else who understands the kind of burdens that I'm under, because he's under the same thing, and that's Captain de Fuhrer Commander Matthew Heimbach, who's finally seen the light, guys. Glory, hallelujah. This is terribly moving for me. The light upon light production.
My name is Matthew Heimbach.
Thank you,
I'm from
Matthew.
a small town called Poolesville, Maryland. And for the majority of my adult life, I've been the future face of organized hate. I've spent, realistically.
Yeah, I know what that's like, man. For years, I've also been like the face of organized hate, and it's really taken a toll on me. I've really suffered for being so incredibly influential as the voice. Like, it's been Matt and I just doing this lonely work.
About the last 10 years of my life engaging in the white nationalist movement and leading a large portion of it. My trajectory in the movement, I think I followed what a lot of people did, and you can see kind of what they began to call the alt-right. I created a white student union on my college campus because there were 26 different other ethnic organizations. I thought white students deserved one too. But very quickly that kind of brought me down a rabbit hole. I, was forced to kind of make a choice there, and I decided to double down, which ended up with me creating the Traditionalist Workers Party, which was a political party that was National Socialist in orientation. And of course, everything always led to Charlottesville, that pretty much everyone in the world knows, which really was kind of the high watermark, I think, of the alt-right. But, we were involved also in campaigning for Donald Trump in 2016, political rallies from coast to coast, organizing chapters, and I was incredibly involved on a grassroots level of building a network, where we were having the largest rallies that we've seen in the United States in 20 plus years.
The best
so
rallies.
For me,
just amazing
being
rallies.
Involved as a grassroots organizer,
just the biggest
it definitely
rallies,
put me
guys.
in a unique position.
Yeah, and I mean, I know about unique positions, guys. I mean, I have been in crazy positions. Did I tell you about the time I went to interview Kit Natividad, or some of my deep undercover work in the San Fernando Valley? I've been in like the craziest, wildest positions. You don't know the burdens that I've suffered from. That Commander Heimbach and I, we understand the burden of leadership, because we practically, through our charisma, we just send lightning bolts out just from our eyes. Okay, so I'm reading this terrific book that forms the title of this stream. Not Born Yesterday: The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe. Yeah, we call our influences shapeshifters, and here I am shapeshifting for you. So the author Hugo Mercier says, he's French, evolution makes gullibility maladaptive, so as not to be abused by senders of unreliable messages. We are endowed with a suite of cognitive mechanisms that help us decide how much weight to put on what we hear or read. Whoa! So I thought that I was so dangerous that YouTube had to shadow ban me because I was so incredibly influential. That if I transmit the incorrect information about COVID-19, then I thought thousands of people were going to die, because so many people, like tens of thousands of people, are looking to me for medical advice, for spiritual advice, for religious advice, for political advice, for life advice, for love advice, for hate advice. I thought, because of my incredible range of my influence, that that's why YouTube is shadow banning me, because people are just putty in my hands. That's what it's like to be so incredibly charismatic. Okay. So we're endowed with a suite of cognitive mechanisms that help us decide how much weight to put on what we hear or read. To do so, these open vigilance mechanisms consider a number of cues. Are good arguments being offered? Is the source competent? Does the source have my interests at heart? Oh, so maybe I'm not as incredibly influential and demagogic and charismatic as I'd hoped. When it comes to large audiences, for better or worse, these cues do not scale up well. Argumentation is most efficient in the context of a small group discussion, with its back and forth of arguments and counter-arguments. When aiming a YouTube live stream at millions, like this YouTube live stream is aimed at millions of people. Speakers like me, we have to resort to common denominators, and we cannot anticipate the many objections that are certain to arise, but I'll be paying attention to the chat and cataloging your certain objections. Demonstrating competence to a wide audience is difficult. Well, I don't know. I got my cricket bat here, got my tennis ball. I'll demonstrate my bloody competence. With limited knowledge and attention span, how are listeners supposed to know who is the most competent politician or economist? Similarly, credibly displaying one's goodwill is easier said than done, as building trust is best done slowly, absolutely, one individual at a time. When our more sophisticated open vigilance mechanisms do not operate, we are left with plausibility checking. It's always on and ever vigilant. Wow. So the essential argument of this book, sum it up in one sentence: evolution makes gullibility maladaptive. We were not born yesterday. So plausibility checking is a disproportionate influence on mass persuasion. Okay, it exerts a disproportionate influence, making it tremendously difficult to change people's minds. At best, mass persuaders like me. I mean, how many people have I got watching this stream right now? 8 people. We can hope to spread messages that conform with the public's pre-existing plans and beliefs. With a bit of work, we'll be able to affect the audience at the margin on issues for which the audience is ambivalent or had weak opinions to start with. Yeah, so that essentially lays out why, in part, some pundits become successful and some don't, because you are serving an audience. You are telling an audience what they want to hear. You tune into JF Garapi, and he will consistently tell you the most white nationalist stuff consistently that he can get away with on YouTube. So you know where he's coming from. You know he has a solid audience, and he's never going to discomfort that point of view. Then other people will give you, say, the traditional Roman Catholic perspective. Other people, like me, will give you the quintessential Orthodox Jewish perspective. Well, this stream doesn't, I don't think it feeds a particular audience. Maybe it feeds people who are scoffers and mockers. But other than that, there's not like a strong ideological content to streams that is consistent. I'm not feeding an audience what they want to hear, whether it's capitalism or socialism or communism or Nazism or Judaism or Christianity or Islam. There's not a consistent feeding of an audience the things that it wants to hear. But that's what you have to do to be a successful pundit. So you have to feed a particular audience, because you can't change people's minds directly. All right? So at best, mass persuaders can hope to spread messages that conform with the public's pre-existing plans and beliefs. So a YouTuber whose streams are devoted to matters of ideology and belief is only begun to get a mass following if he feeds that mass following what it wants to hear. So just take the Gedolim, the great Haredi rabbis. As soon as they step out of line with what the Gedolim want to hear, they're no longer Gedolim. They're no longer leaders. It's not that these guys can take, hundreds of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews in any direction they want. No, they only have power as long as they tell the people what they want to hear. And at most, they can just influence people on the margin on issues for which their audience is ambivalent or has weak opinions to start with. So yeah, you want to build a mass following for your YouTube show on politics or religion, your YouTube show on ideas, then you have to focus it on skeptics. So you feed the skeptic audience what it wants to hear, or you feed the trad Catholic audience what it wants to hear, or you feed the nationalist movement what it wants to hear, or the Jewish movement what it wants to hear. And then that's the way that you can build up a mass following, because you consistently tell people what they want to hear. If you create a show like this one where you don't consistently tell people what they want to hear, where you're not consistently feeding a particular ideological perspective on life and telling them how the elites are screwing them and the system's against them, and here's the magic key to understanding the world, like group X is responsible for 99.9% of evil in the world, then you're going to have a lot of challenge developing a mass following, because mass followings only come when you tell the masses what they want to hear. Okay, Commander Heimbach, I think he understands these things.
One of the biggest things that, as my trajectory continued, I began to realize, the movement in general, I think, can really be summed up a lot like the election. Like, I was excited about the idea of an infrastructure bill to revitalize my community. I was excited about ending foreign wars. I was excited about draining the swamp and all these things. And then all we got was business as usual. And just like I got involved in the movement where I thought we were going to do all these great things and build all these things, and it just ended up not coming to fruition. Back in 2018, my last real foray into the movement was temporarily being a member of the National Socialist Movement, where I had joined under the pretenses that we were going to modernize the organization and move the ideology in a far less supremacist and reactionary narrative, but the rank and file was not supportive of that change. So I resigned and was kicked out after I'd already resigned, being called a communist. I guess if the red star fits, then, that's kind of appropriate. What's really changed my perspective is kind of expanding the scope of what defines my community. It's not just poor white people that are being left behind, it's poor people in general. And it's not just poor people here in Appalachia or in the South or in the United States, it's really across the world. So that for me has really kind of been a big change to kind of reframe everything. So over the past 2 years, I've really kind of developed a different perspective on politics, and now I'm here trying to do something different with Light Upon Light and Parallel Networks. I had spent a lot of time just kind of on the sidelines. I was just going to be apolitical, wasn't going to be involved in any capacity. But as we see more arrests, especially with groups like the Base and Atomwaffen Division and things like that, I feel like my perspective is something that people know that I've walked that road, that I understand them, I know where they're coming from, and these guys need help. I understand that what brought me into the movement was really seeing economic, social, and political alienation and abandonment of my community, and following the model of studies done with anti-jihadist work in Europe, where the first thing you have to do is establish a line of communication, a line of support, and start a process first of just humanizing them, listening to them, and then trying to find ways to help them to be able to begin a process of de-radicalization through.
See, Commander Heimbach, he understands these things. America's Fuhrer understands the burden of charisma, the burden of leadership, the capacity to shape thousands of people just with your words. Just, you've got the whole world in your hands, and you can move it this way or that way because of the strength of your charisma. The crown weighs heavily upon the king, let me tell you. Okay, so in the Hitler myth, historian Ian Kershaw describes how Hitler was perceived by ordinary Germans throughout his political career, how he gained for a time broad popular support. The key to Hitler's electoral success in 1933 was that he embodied an already well-established extensive ideological consensus. He surfed on a wave of virulent anti-Marxism, cause he shared with the church and the business elites. From 1927 to 33, Hitler used innovative campaign strategies, techniques that have now become commonplace. He flew across Germany so that he could reach more people. He used loudspeakers, amplifying his voice to make the best of a full rhetorical arsenal. He gave hundreds of speakers to crowds large and small. Were these efforts successful? A careful study suggests they weren't. Hitler's countless speeches had negligible impact on the Nazis' electoral fortunes. Once he rose to power, Hitler's appeal waxed and waned with economic and military vicissitudes. He gained in popularity from those who benefited from his policies, and with the general public when painless military victories came in quick succession. As early as 1939, however, as Germans tightened their belts for the war effort, discontent began to grow. After the Nazi disaster that was the Battle of Stalingrad, support for Hitler disintegrated. People stopped seeing him as an inspirational leader. Vicious rumors started to circulate. Even though it was a capital crime from 1943 until his suicide in April 1945, many Germans were openly critical of Hitler. So far from shaping German public opinion, Hitler responded to it. Hitler had an extremely sensitive awareness of the tolerance level of the mass of the population. To gain control, he had to preach messages that ran against his worldview. He downplayed his anti-Semitism, barely mentioning it in public speeches, refusing to sign the appeal for a boycott of Jewish shops. So like other demagogues, Hitler was unable to rely on his own powers of persuasion to influence the masses. Rather, he played on people's existing opinions. The Nazi propaganda machine as a whole was barely more effective. But what about religious figures like prophets? History suggests prophets are able to whip up crowds into the kind of fervor that leads to suicidal acts, from self-sacrifice to doomed crusades. But really, what matters is the audience's state of mind and material conditions, not the prophet's powers of persuasion. Once people are ready for extreme actions, some prophet or YouTube live streamer will come along and provide the spark that lights the fire. And Commander Heimbach, he knows all about lighting sparks.
For really being understanding and compassionate, where my trajectory has led me is to a belief that a different form of politics is necessary, one built on grassroots organizing that involves all people, because that's the only way we're going to make change. It's not going from the top down, it's going to be from the bottom up. That isn't being done here in the United States at all, with the exception of the efforts that are being put forward by Parallel Networks. So that's why I thought it would be really exciting to get involved on the ground.
Wow, what
I support
happened?
Light Upon Light primarily because, in my experience, ever since I've been in the movement, I've been approached by formers, if you want to call them that, people that used to be involved in the movement in some capacity. And overwhelmingly, a lot of people with good intentions, but I wasn't particularly impressed.
What's really sad is that this video only has 17 thumbs up and 438 thumbs down. Wow, it looks like the forces of hatred are winning out there with Commander Heimbach. Okay, let's get back to this excellent book by Hugo Mercier. So, millenarianism, the religion of the oppressed, that's where Seventh-day Adventism came out of, which was the way I was raised. It mostly arises under conditions of crisis, of oppression by a more powerful group, of extreme economic hardship, of fundamental social changes that leave people feeling threatened. Challenging the social order is the quintessential breaking of norms, requires strong justifications, and millenarianism, its beliefs, provide such justifications. It is fine to wreck things as the world is going to end anyway, and something much better will follow. This is why millenarian beliefs can be found in so many moments of contestation across different cultures. If the best known millenarian beliefs are Christian, the idea long predates the New Testament. It can also be found in Jewish or Zoroastrian texts. What about preachers, mate? What about the preachers? Well, millenarian prophecies are successful when they are convenient. They surface across many different cultures when people mount radical contestations of the existing order. Even secular upheavals have their own versions of millenarianism. The market for prophecies of doom is driven by the demands of discontented crowds rather than by the supply of sly prophets. So yeah, if you build a YouTube channel around predictions of doom, the world is falling apart, that the end times are near, that the elites are screwing you, you're going to build an audience if you consistently feed that. But if you then try to lead people in a new direction, they're not going to follow you. Okay, so if I was doing a live stream right now on the alt-right, then I'd have like 5 times the audience, but having a kind of contradictory live stream, that's not going to build the same kind of audience as opposed to when you're just consistently feeding people their ideological presuppositions back to them. Well, how about one individual's vision might be communicated to millions or even billions of followers in the case of Christianity or Islam? What about mass conversion? Okay, so far from preachers managing feats of mass persuasion, religious conversion is usually driven by strong pre-existing relationships. Friends recruit friends, families bring other family members into the fold. So my father was a Christian evangelist, and he would go around preaching all over the world, and when he'd get together with other evangelists, they'd compare numbers about how many people they converted. It's like, oh, I baptized 173 people in Moscow, and I baptized 827 people in the Philippines, and I baptized 57 people in Bakersfield. So to the that kind of preacher man, everyone they meet is just fodder for Christ. Even if people are recruited by friends or family, conversion can entail some social costs inflicted by those not already converted, ranging from misunderstanding to persecution. People who convert find something to their liking in their new group. Psychological and emotional conditions of most converts improve rather than decline after joining. Even costly behaviors can be beneficial. Mormons, for example, have to donate 10% of their income, 10% of their time to the church. But people prefer to live in a community in which everyone shares so much. It enables Mormons to lavish social services upon one another. Even early Christians who are at great risk of persecution benefited from the support networks created by their adherence to this new cult. And the exotic beliefs of the cult, the exotic beliefs new religion play a minor post hoc role. Belief typically follows involvement. Strong attachments draw people into religious groups, but strong beliefs develop more slowly or never develop at all. New religious movements grow by offering people social interaction they enjoy. So I used to go to yoga, Kundalini yoga. Some people said it's a cult, and I like going to Kundalini yoga. I like the people there, and so I understood why so many people would spend thousands of dollars getting Kundalini yoga teacher training and effectively joined the group because they enjoyed the interactions. Okay, let's go back to Commander Heimbach.
First of all, by the fact that there was no conversations, especially about legitimizing the real struggles that members of my community and myself in general in my life deal with and fight with. And I don't know how you can go through the hollers of West Virginia or Kentucky or the rusted out former industrial towns of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and not see real struggles and real people suffering and real people dying. And I never heard anyone even seem to care about the people who are suffering. Like, why do people join the far right as a movement? You know, a simplistic view is to say, oh, these people are backwards or they're hate filled. Dehumanization, I think, only increases polarization. It only increases the problems, and it doesn't address any of the things that are at the root of violent extremism and political polarization. So for me, what really, really was unique about Light Upon Light and Parallel Networks is that it starts from a process, first of all, of listening and humanizing people and trying to address root problems and actually treat violence as a symptom, not something that just needs to be stamped out with a boot. But you have to address things like mental health care, economic stability, housing, people not feeling that they're listened to in a political system that forces them.
Okay, this is hilarious that he's releasing this video on April 1st. So, the Catholic Church is often described as ruling supreme over the European Middle Ages. Mixture of deference, ignorance, and fear of hell supposedly enabled the Church to make a sheepish population obey its injunctions and accept its doctrines. But from the reports on the ground, the Church, for all its power, was barely able to get people to conform to the bare minimum of their doctrinal requirements, to be baptized, to know the Our Father prayer, to take communion once a year. Reports on the ground have complained of people going to church only to pass gossip. Yeah, the flock did enjoy saints' days, yet it wasn't the church that benefited, but innkeepers and prostitutes. Believers went on pilgrimages, the occasion for more sin than a participant committed in all the rest of the year put together. The poor not only turned religious ceremonies into opportunities for debauchery, but actively resisted any costly behavior the church attempted to impose. The medieval masses also rejected the bulk of Catholic doctrinal orthodoxy. The pattern observed in Catholic medieval Europe recurs in economically dominated classes throughout the world. Far from having imbibed the dominant ideology, everywhere people practice the arts of resistance with the weapons of the weak. Okay, so there are only very few opinions that are permitted on COVID-19 on social media. We're getting like indoctrinated about how we're supposed to respond to this virus. All the elites seem to be lined up to just completely narrow and snuff out all discussion, right? But how's that affecting you? You're practicing the art of resistance with the weapons of the weak. Even with the strongest of power asymmetrics, that between masters and slaves, that cannot make subordinates accept their plight. Are you accepting social media censorship? Are you accepting everything that you're supposed to believe about COVID-19? No. The slaves keep fighting by any means available, ranging from foot dragging, dissimulation, false compliance, all the way to arson and sabotage. Sounds like the people in the chat. So the dominant ideology thesis has a point. The dominant classes weave narratives of the status quo as the best of all possible worlds. Their superior position of the elites is well deserved. These narratives crowd communication channels from manuscripts to airwaves. This does not mean that people farther down the social ladder, like us, are necessarily buying any of it. On the contrary, these narratives are resisted everywhere and alternative narratives created, including millenarian visions when an opportunity for revolution rises. Let's get back to Commander Heimbach.
At least in their own mind, to lash out in violent ways. That if you don't start from a point of compassion and understanding and humanizing people, then all you're ever going to do is see more tragic incidents of violence, more people throwing their lives away, and the problem's going to get worse. And Parallel Networks and Light Upon Light is taking an entirely different approach to law enforcement agencies than former organizations. They're doing something unique here in the United States that no one else is doing. So that to me was pretty exciting. The
Yeah.
biggest way to be able to solve the issues of violence is people need to feel empowered. The biggest thing, first of all, is to, I think, approach people that are in the movement and begin a process of dialogue to be able to help them find more productive avenues where they don't have to.
So you've probably been told that people are really gullible, that if you simply go into a room and start yawning, then other people will start yawning too. But guess what? If people don't like you, they're not going to start yawning too. All right? If you go into a room and you smile at people, people who like you will be more likely to smile back, but people who don't like you will be more likely to frown. So let's say I hate Mike Enoch, for example. So if I'm having an interaction with Mike Enoch or just watching him in a video, and let's say I hate him, then when Mike Enoch smiles, I'm going to likely frown. When Mike Enoch looks worried or concerned or fearful, I'm going to likely smile. So when you have two different football teams playing each other, the fans of Team A are going to feel happy when the fans of Team B look sad. And the fans of Team B are going to feel sad when the fans of Team A look happy. So we're not automatons. You can't just program people by going in there and smiling or yawning and or giving like demagogic rhetoric and just, wrap people around your finger. Does not work that way. So now a tremendous amount of research has been dedicated to the question of deception detection. How good are we at spotting liars? Many people are quite confident in their ability to spot a liar. There are all sorts of cues they believe, and there are lie detector tests, and there are micro expressions. But upon examination, all these methods for detecting lies don't really play out once you try to replicate studies. So there aren't all these, awesome methods for detecting when people tell lies. So why are there no reliable behavioral cues to lying and deception? Because people feel conflicting emotions, whether they are lying or telling the truth, and it makes them difficult to distinguish liars from truth tellers. Such cues can't be evolutionary stable. If cues existed, they would have been selected out in the same way that a poker player would not have any tell when bluffing. So evolutionarily valid behavioral cues to deception would be maladaptive. So if we cannot rely on behavioral cues, how do we deal with the issue of deceit in communication? How do we know who to trust? Because deceit relies on hidden intentions, it is intrinsically hard to detect. But we determine who to trust by how well we know someone and whether our interests align. If you feel that my interests align with your interests, you're going to listen to me more seriously. If you feel that my interests are the opposite of your interests, you're going to tend to reject everything I say. So we try to look for what are the incentives. Are the incentives between us aligned or in conflict? So we are quite good at taking natural alignments between incentives into account. Even babies at age 2 do this. Participants put more weight on those people who they see as having similar incentives to them. There's this famous story of Max Gettelman and Karl Kirchner. Gettelman was a Jewish American soldier being captured by the Germans in 1944. He's being held prisoner close to the Eastern Front. Kirchner was a wounded German soldier recovering at home close to the prison camp. The two had met while Gendelman was in the camp. He managed to escape. He took refuge in Kirchner's home. Kirchner, the German, told Gendelman, the Jew, that as a German soldier, he had to flee the Russian advance, and the two should help each other. Gendelman needed Kirchner to avoid being shot by the Germans looking for escapees. Kirchner needed Gendelman to avoid being shot by the Americans once they would reach the American lines. So this alignment in their incentives allowed the two former enemies to communicate, collaborate until they were safely behind American lines. So if I'm somewhere and things look tense and I spot someone else who's wearing a yarmulke, then I'm going to throw down with that person. Like, I'm going to see us as having aligned incentives, even if I hate him for every reason under the sun. If there's like suddenly a pogrom breaking out, I'm going to have common incentives with other Orthodox Jews. So we look for people with whom we have common aligned incentives. So people put more weight on what people say when they detect an alignment in incentives. And they can also stop listening to their most trusted friends or dearest family members when the incentives are not aligned, such as when playing poker. So both children and adults will be wary of self-interested claims. So I remember there was the Morris, I think there was a mentally ill institute where in the Kurambong area when I was growing up. And all these mentally ill people who were in the institution, they'd come walking by every afternoon to go to the store. And I figured because they were mentally ill, therefore I'd be able to rip them off. They'd often be carrying a radio. So I tried to sell them my underwear, like exchange my underwear for their radio. And even though these people were mentally ill, none of them would go for any of my schemes to rip them off. So even the mentally ill, they know about incentives and whether incentives are aligned or not. So a mother might want her son to be a doctor so that she gains in social status. Your friend might want you to be successful, but perhaps not vastly more successful than himself. Humans have developed a great way of making incentives fall in line, and that's reputation. So what happens when incentives diverge? Well, it's very costly to punish people who give us bad information, but we have ways of signaling, such as by getting angry. When people get angry, we don't know how they're going to react, and so that's evolutionarily useful. Aren't many successful politicians or business people full of bluster? Will confidence be persuasive? No, just because someone is tremendously confident, that's not going to make them more persuasive. Deciding who to trust has little to do with looking for signs of nervousness or attempting to spot elusive micro expressions. It's not even primarily about catching liars. Instead, it's about recognizing who is diligent in communicating with us, who has similar incentives to us, and how trustworthy are they. Can we trust these people to be diligent when their incentives align with us? Incentives between sender and receiver are frequently naturally aligned, such as when people are in the same boat or the same synagogue or the same church or the same political or social or cultural or religious movement. Because we're able to track other people's commitments and adjust our trust accordingly. Most human communication isn't cheap talk, but costly signals. We pay if our messages turn out to be unreliable. So when I converted to Judaism, most of my friends from my Christian upbringing suddenly saw that we had different allegiances, different incentives, different alliances, and all that trust and commonality and mutuality that we had in the past, then that got blown up. So if you have a friend who changes religion on you and converts to a different religion than yours, then you're going to feel that there have been pretty significant breaks in your alignment of interests, alignment of incentives. The positive effect that a celebrity might have for a product is frequently swamped by the fallout of negative information about the celebrity emerges. Following revelations about Tiger Woods philandering 3 brands that had recruited him, Pepsi, Electronic Arts, and Nike, lost nearly $6 billion in market value. Politicians are barely rewarded for keeping their electoral promises, but they suffer enormous electoral costs when they are convicted of corruption. And then we have all these analogies about emotional contagion, right? If I'm smiling, are you going to just get caught up in the contagion so that you can't help smiling?
Feel this drive to be engaged in violence, but then work on a larger level to address the inequalities that are within our system. The issues of globalization, the issues of a capitalist economy that are really driving people into the dirt where they can't be able to take care of their families. They can't keep a roof over their head. It leads to insecurity. That we need to address these systemic problems, issues of like having proper education for people, which here in the United States, a lot of working class people don't have access to the types of education to get jobs where they can provide a basic standard of living for.
Okay, so people are discussing YouTube's shadow banning. So, various people that you may be subscribing to, their feeds are not showing up on your channel anymore. You're not getting notifications. People who follow me, subscribe to me, they're not getting notifications of my streams. So this is deliberate policy by YouTube because most of its human workforce is now at home and is not efficiently working from home. They've largely turned YouTube over to algorithms, and because they don't want to spread misinformation, get hammered by the news media for spreading misinformation about COVID-19, that if there are streams that their algorithms detect are possibly spreading misinformation or certainly challenging consensus about COVID-19, then they effectively shadow ban the stream. So that happens to me, happens to Kevin Michael Grace, has not happened to JF Garapi, has not happened to Stefan Molyneux. So it's not YouTube server is bugging out because of the shutdown. This is deliberate YouTube policy to try to restrict dissident streams such as this one, such as Kevin Michael Grace's and a lot of other people's. So subscribers are not getting notified. It's deliberate YouTube policy. And it's due to an algorithm, according to YouTube, though there may be some human element, but it's deliberate YouTube policy to not send out notifications for my channel. That's been going on for weeks now. Also, YouTube states it. They explained it. They said that they were going to do this, that because they don't have as many humans around to monitor live streams, that a lot of live streams are going to be essentially shadow banned and hidden. And a lot of the decisions will just be turned over to the algorithm. Okay, so what about emotional contagion? Is it an epidemic? Okay, is it an outbreak? Is it a spread? Is it an affectation? Is it a contagion? Is there an epidemic of laughter? And we have these same analogies for how people supposedly act in crowds. In crowds, ideas, sentiments, emotions, beliefs possess a power of contagion as intense as that of microbes, some have said. Urban crowds are those in which contagion is fastest, most intense, and powerful. Moral contagion is as certain as physical disease. So this analogy between the spread of emotions and pathogens flourished in the second half of the 19th century. It's the golden age of the germ theory of disease. And the contagion analogy would only grow more successful. It was used to describe panics as the supposed reactions to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast, when thousands of listeners thinking that Martians had landed were supposed to have fled in panic. Not true, but this is supposedly the first viral media. Armies are depicted as routing in a contagion of bewilderment and fear and ignorance. Nowadays, talk of contagion of viruses has become ubiquitous when describing the effects of social media. Take the phrase viral marketing. 2014, 2 articles were published in the prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that attempted to detect and manipulate emotional contagion in social networks. But it's bogus. Not true. People are not born yesterday. So supposedly there are all these automatic reactions to emotional signals that when I smile, you smile back. When I'm sad, you feel sad back. When I'm angry, you get angry. Okay, this is what we're taught, that these instantaneous activation of facial muscles is a sign of contagion. People automatically take on the facial expressions of those they observe, leading them to feel the same emotions. And this mimicry can extend to third parties. Okay, it doesn't really work that way. Okay, so from the evolutionary perspective, such emotional contagion is implausible. If emotions were truly contagious, if they forced irrepressible mimicry, they would be too easily abused. Cheaters could laugh till those they have cheated laughed with them. Mortal enemies could get their opponents to empathize with and care for them. If our emotions were so easily manipulated, we would be much better off not paying any attention to emotional signals. So, in essence, you are not going to be affected by the emotions of people you don't like or trust, people that you don't feel you have similar incentives. Okay, we express anger to impress on others that we have been wronged, and that this better not happen again. If the only effect of expressing anger were to make others angry in turn, expressing anger would be counterproductive. So it's not that like begets like. Emotion simply has to provoke a reaction, even if the reaction is different from the initial emotion. So, what keeps emotional signals broadly reliable? What keeps them beneficial on average for those who receive them? Economist Robert Frank wrote the most thought-provoking book about the function of emotions since Darwin, Passions Within Reason. He argues that displaying emotions can be rational. Anger has evolved to express one's commitment to possibly retaliate if wronged, regardless of the cost of the retaliation. People can afford to react more automatically to emotional signals because emotional signals are sent automatically and thus impossible to fake. But from an evolutionary point of view, this reasoning does not hold water. If some behaviors or emotional displays are able to reliably elicit a reaction in their audience, individuals would evolve to send these signals whenever it was in their interest to do so, even if that meant sending unreliable signals. But if you're sending unreliable emotional signals, people won't trust you, they won't like you, and they will shy away from you. Okay, let's get back to Commander Heimbach, America's Führer.
Themselves. And to be able to find better ways, more productive ways to empower individuals and communities to build a better world. It really starts with listening, though, and understanding and trying to address the symptoms, by addressing the causes. That's the way I think we stop violence, is addressing the root causes that drive people to extremism. The symptoms will resolve themselves. I think my biggest advice for people that are involved in extremist movements is, first of all, you're not alone. And acting out in ways of violence only ends up hurting other innocent people. And we can see that time and time again. So the best thing to do to really want a change, because I know if you're involved in one of these organizations and you've experienced job loss, you've experienced being distant from your family, you've experienced physical violence against yourself, you've dealt with all sorts of different types of persecution. You're obviously incredibly driven, probably very well read, and you want to build a better world. Everything that drives you is probably to build a better world. So why not join all the other people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, religions, and cultures that are also dealing with many of these same problems and also want to build a better world? To just kind of raise your gaze a little bit to say, all of us are in this together and you can be a part of that solution. It just takes not isolating yourself and walling yourself off in a movement that has done absolutely nothing to make our people's lives better here in the United States, for whether you're talking about white people or anyone else. We need to be involved in a wider and broader struggle together.
Okay, Matthew Heimbach there, light upon light shapeshifter for April Fool's Day. Very, very moving. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Okay, how should emotional vigilance function? It should be attuned to the properties of different emotions. Disgust, for example, might offer fewer opportunities for manipulation than anger. Making people disgusted appears less useful. When reacting to emotional signals, the following three factors should be relevant across all emotions: what our prior beliefs and plans are, in what context the signals are produced, and whether the sender is trustworthy. Even babies and toddlers take these factors into account when reacting to emotional signals. Not many parents will be surprised to hear that children are masters of selective ignorance. They pay attention to what their parents say only when it suits them. The key to the stability of emotional signals. Many are rejected outright, and those who abuse the signals end up paying the price. The reputation suffers as is the reputation of those who break more explicit commitments. Senders of unreliable emotional signals are trusted less when they send emotional signals and possibly when they employ other forms of communication as well. What about adults? Adults also adjust their reactions to emotional signals as a function of their source and of the context in which the signals are emitted. Participants automatically mimic the smile or frown expressed by someone they like and trust who has similar interests, and when the participants expect to cooperate later on. When the participants are dealing with people that they are going to compete against, they tend to show the opposite reaction. They smile when the Confederates receive a shock and frown when they are rewarded. Women do not mimic the expressions of those who behave unfairly toward them. Men express positive emotions when others show fear and negative emotions when others show joy, if the others are fans of a rival sports team. Even catching yawns, a seemingly perfect example of irresistible contagion, is not as reflexive as it seems. People are more likely to start yawning when they see people they know rather than strangers yawn. Adults increasingly mistrust those who misrepresent their emotions. For example, people who feign anger to obtain strategic advantages in negotiations. Our reactions to emotional signals might be automatic, but they are far from mandatory. They adapt according to a number of factors, including our pre-existing plans or beliefs, the context, and the source's credibility. So contagion's not a good analogy for how emotional signals work between people. In the various cases of mass psychogenic illness, what clearly sets apart the contagion perspective is who these behaviors spread to. They always spread to a particular group, usually of the same sex. Symptoms typically affect a few dozen people at most, all of them members of the same group: pupils in a school, workers in a factory, inhabitants of a small village. In contemporary cases of mass psychogenic illness, the area soon swarms with journalists, government representatives, experts, and rubberneckers. None of them are ever affected. Usually only one gender or age group is affected. In high schools, the weird behavior is communicated along the typical fault lines of teenage social life. Cool kids who hang out together are affected first, followed later by less popular teens. Then what about crowds? Well, crowds, again, they tend to react in their own self-interest. They tend to react rationally. They just don't get all hysterical and do things that are against their interests. In occasions like horrific occasions like the 9/11 terrorist attack or the terrorist attack on Bataclan in Paris, most people react by being calm. Substantial minority were helpful. And the anti-social actions of people pushing others to get out, to get to the exit, these were driven by rational, albeit selfish factors such as the possibility of escape rather than sheer panic. In every emergency situation, a few people do react as if panicked, such as rushing for an exit. But panic is a misleading description because it says the behavior is irrational and easily transmitted. But fleeing by any means available in the face of shots fired or other threats is hardly irrational. When panic doesn't spread, most people behave calmly enough, and many help others, in particular the most vulnerable. So this popular image of crowds, whether they are rioting or panicking, suffers from the illusion of unanimity, an intuition that all crowd members are going to behave in the same way. Even when crowd members share an ideology, their behavior is heterogeneous. They do not necessarily follow each other. They do not necessarily follow the leaders. They're completely capable of thinking for themselves. What's going on with Tucker Carlson?
For unemployment benefits. More than 3 million Americans filed for unemployment benefits the last week of March. That's more than quadruple the previous record in the history of the country. Yet in a matter of months, jobless figures like that, 3 million, could look small by comparison. Goldman Sachs estimates that later this year, America's unemployment rate could hit 15%. That would be the highest figure since the 1930s. That's almost 25 million people out of work. And Goldman's estimate is not even the highest one. Economists at the St. Louis branch of the Federal Reserve Bank are projecting an unemployment peak as high as 32%. That's 47 million people out of work. In case you're wondering, that is worse than the worst year of the Great Depression, much worse, actually. At some point, coronavirus will be gone, but unfortunately, we could live with the crushing unemployment numbers for far longer. And that's a disaster for people, for individuals, for families. But it's also a threat to the stability of our country. Nothing makes a nation more volatile than huge numbers of people who don't have jobs. That's always true. So we need to do whatever we can to prevent that from happening. But here's the amazing thing. The federal government is doing its best tonight to make it much worse. Here's how. Today, April 1st, the Department of Homeland Security released 20,000 new H-2B visas for seasonal guest workers to come into America and take jobs in industries like landscaping, food processing, and resorts. Another 15,000 visas will become available next month in May. Now, these are bonus visas, by the way. By law, the United States only has to offer 66,000 H-2B visas a year. But Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf has used his discretionary powers to add 35,000 extra visas. So that's a total of 100,000 workers coming to this country to take jobs during the single biggest unemployment crisis in a century. It's demented. And yet it gets worse than that. Yesterday, DHS notified 85,000 new winners of the H-1B visa lottery. Today, those winners can begin filling out their full visa applications for jobs that will begin in October. That's just when unemployment could be at its peak and coronavirus could be making a comeback as the weather cools. Those are the forecasts. H-1B visas are supposed to allow companies to hire foreigners with extraordinary skills that simply don't exist in the American workforce. It's a fraud, of course, a well-documented fraud. In practice, the visas are used to import tens of thousands of tech workers from India so Silicon Valley can profit from a cheaper workforce. Nothing against the workers, but they're taking jobs that would go to Americans. The big winners in this scheme are companies like Apple, Google, and IBM, which take in hundreds of H-1B workers every year. At many companies, including AT&T, as we chronicled recently on this show, American workers are ordered to train their foreign replacements and then fired once they're no longer useful. This has been going on for a long time. It's always been disgusting. But now it's a threat to our country, and that's not an overstatement. In a year where tens of millions of Americans could be looking for work, our government is importing more than 150,000 workers from abroad. And that's without counting thousands of H-2A agricultural workers who will be coming as well. The president needs to stop this from happening, and he can. If President Obama was able to ignore existing immigration law and create DACA, and he did, then certainly the current president has the power to cut legal immigration in order to protect the nation. And in fact, American law gives him explicitly this right. Here it is. This is from Section 1182F of Title 8 in the U.S. Code. Quote, whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or of any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may make a proclamation, and for such period as he shall deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem appropriate, end quote. It's very clear. And the Supreme Court just affirmed this law 2 years ago in the case of the president's travel ban. So it's real. Now, that ban, you'll remember, was levied to protect Americans from terrorism. But now we're facing an immeasurably greater crisis than terrorism. We're facing a global calamity that could wreck our economy, fracture our society, because that's always a byproduct of it, erode our rights, shatter our institutions, transform this country into a poor country, a has-been ex-superpower beholden to China. That could happen. Preventing that from happening is the most important test this president or any president in our lifetime will face. The time to placate corporate interests looking for low wages at all costs has passed. We need to stop this.
Okay, back to the book Not Born Yesterday. Instead of indiscriminately catching whatever emotion we happen to witness, we exert emotional vigilance even when we are in the middle of a crowd. For us to react to emotional signals in the way intended by their sender, the reaction has to suit our current plans and mental states, and the sender has to be someone we like, who has not proven unreliable in the past, and whose emotion seems justified, and whose interests are likely to align with ours. Otherwise, we might not react at all, or we might react in a way opposite to that intended, rejoicing in someone's pain or being angered by a display of anger. And so how successful are the propagandists? While he was in jail working on Mein Kampf, Hitler thought a lot about propaganda. He described the masses as credulous, a crowd of human children. and he thought that he could propagandize them to think as he does. Well, how effective was Nazi propaganda? Well, it seemed that people who were already anti-Semitic, it helped to make them more anti-Semitic, but people who were not anti-Semitic, it had a negative effect. Germans didn't heed the call to boycott Jewish stores and to ostracize the Jews more generally. It was only through terror and legal discrimination that Nazis achieved the economic and increasingly social exclusion of Jews from German life. Other dimensions of Nazi propaganda were even less effective than the attempts to turn all Germans into rabid anti-Semites. The push to enforce compulsory euthanasia of the handicapped was widely resisted, and eventually the Nazis abandoned it. Attacks on communism appealed to those already on the right, but were virtually an unmitigated failure among German industrial workers, who were communism's natural constituency. Nazi propaganda failed to persuade the majority of German workers to contribute willingly to the war effort, many electing to resist through absenteeism. As soon as the war took a turn for the worst after Stalingrad, messages from the propaganda ministry fell on deaf ears. Goebbels' unvarying message of victory was becoming monotonic and ignored by the public, who instead trusted the BBC over official government programs. Nazi propaganda even failed to generate much liking for the Nazi Party, whose local officials were often incompetent and corrupt and were often despised. One Nazi office reports, "Our propaganda encounters rejection everywhere among the population because it is regarded as wrong, and lying." Yeah. So, who's the author of this book? Hugo Mercier. He's written a book here on the science of who we trust and what we believe. Let me play a little bit from his interview with Michael Shermer here.
Been gullible, they would have been easily manipulated by others.
Here we go.
Which is to say, obviously we have some gullibility, but we're not completely gullible. You know, what's the balance there? And give us a little background about how you kind of came at this problem.
So, well, thank you for the introduction. And it was kind of funny to me because I don't have a hard copy yet, so I'm kind of jealous of.
There it is. Yeah, no, it's beautiful.
It's the first time. It's not first time.
It's a really nice design, you know, with the red, yellow, and green. We're good to go.
Well, thanks. So the way I came into this was through work that Dan Sperber and a bunch of colleagues. So Dan Sperber was my PhD advisor and did on what he called epistemic vigilance and what I call in the book open vigilance, but it's probably the same concept, which is a set of cognitive mechanisms that we use to evaluate what people tell us. And the idea is that evolutionarily, it wouldn't be quite plausible that humans would be gullible, because essentially if our ancestors had been gullible, they would have been easily manipulated by others and they would not have made it so far. So evolutionarily, the prediction is that people should be quite conservative and quite vigilant and quite good at evaluating what people tell them.
Right. So
what about the German armies that fought to the death in battles they were certain to lose? Aren't they the ultimate proof of the effectiveness of Nazi propaganda? Well, studies of German soldiers consistently show that political values played a very minor part in sustaining their motivation for combat. Instead, as for soldiers everywhere, the main impetus came from the support of the small group they were embedded in, people they had fought alongside for many years and with whom they had shared many hardships, and that created special bonds of loyalty. Fear also played a role, fear of being executed if a desertion attempt failed, as thousands of German soldiers were, fear of dying as a POW in the wrong hands. Few POWs on the Eastern Front ever came back, while the relatively lenient treatment of POWs on the Western Front prompted many desertions. So the effectiveness of Nazi propaganda was heavily dependent on its ability to build on existing consensus, to confirm existing values, to bolster existing prejudices. When propaganda ran against public opinion, it failed abysmally. On the whole, little or no mass persuasion took place. So that's true in general. Propaganda is not nearly as effective as it is touted to be. The way that minds are changed is when you have a great deal in common with the person who's, say, presenting an argument, and the argument that they are presenting simply extends or develops or refines sentiments that you already hold. People don't usually switch in a 180 direction. So if you like the person, or if the idea that's presented to you is congruent with the way you already look at the world, then you're much more likely to be affected by...
like the latest issue of Skeptic, I have Steve Pinker on the cover, and the cover story is, "We are not living in a post-truth world." And this is in response to Lee McIntyre's book, which is called Post-Truth. And then he wrote a rebuttal to Steve's article saying, "We are living in a post-truth world." and the argument I think really depends on how you define post-truth. Steve, in a way, is arguing that there's nothing new about the Trump era of spin doctoring facts and exaggerating things and even lying. Maybe Trump does it a bit more than previous politicians, but there's nothing new to that. And also what's debatable is to what extent people actually believe the lies of the Trump administration more than maybe they believe those of the Bush administration or Obama or anybody, really. And so it kind of comes down to really, how do you define post-truth in the sense of how gullible are we really to fall for political rhetoric like this versus it's really an ancient problem that we've always pushed back against.
So it is indeed an ancient problem, and indeed, the Greeks are well known for warning us against the dangers of demagogues, which I think were exaggerated back in the day and are still exaggerated. In that most of the lies we do believe are lies that we believe because they fit with our pre-existing views. So it's not as if Trump was able, or anybody else really was able, to completely change people's minds through kind of crafty manipulation and lies. Instead, what he does, and what populists do more generally, is tell things that people want to hear and that other politicians weren't necessarily saying before, because it might have been politically incorrect, or no one figured out that's what people wanted to hear. So it's not as if there was kind of really widespread manipulation going on. So there might be widespread lying, but that lying might just be, then again, reinforcing people's prejudices rather than changing them.
Right. I think this is the key sentence in your opening chapter, in which you define these, what you call open vigilance mechanisms, that I want to talk about a little bit. Quote, "These mechanisms allow us to accept most beneficial messages, to be open, while rejecting most harmful messages, to be vigilant." So I gather there you're arguing that there's some balance between being open. This is the way skeptics like to say it. You want to be open-minded enough to accept radical new ideas that are true, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out and you believe every wacky idea that comes down the pike.
Yes, and it is indeed a hard balance to reach. The idea is that, so by default, I think we're more vigilant. So our default reaction is we're only going to accept things that fit with our prior beliefs. And in order to overcome that initial kind of conservativeness or pig-headedness, even, if you will, we look for a number of cues. So we look at whether the person is competent, whether they are the right expertise, whether they have our interests at heart, whether they have good arguments. And as these cues pile up, then we might end up changing our minds.
So what about the Soviet Union? How powerful was its propaganda? Well, early Soviet propaganda failed to resonate with the population. Communist concepts had to be jettisoned in favor of more congenial narratives. Patriotism replaced internationalism. The cult of heroes replaced impersonal historical forces. This strategy backfired badly when many of the heroes were then killed during the show trials of the late 1930s. Soviet propaganda never recovered. Even at the apex of Stalinist propaganda, Russian workers and peasants adopted many tactics of passive resistance and actively sought out alternative sources of information. It's mostly those who benefited from the regime who appeared to accept its values. Even now, Russian propaganda efforts, for example in Ukraine, follow a familiar pattern, succeeding modestly when preaching to the choir, backfiring when targeting opponents. Propaganda by the other great communist power, China, was barely more convincing. So it convinced people who benefited from Mao's policies, and those who were hurt by Mao's policies, well, it did not persuade them at all.
Yeah, I think of some of these classic social psych experiments where like smoke comes into a room and everybody sitting at a table is a shill except for the one subject, and they're all filling out forms. We actually did a replication of this for NBC a few years ago. And I was always troubled by these experiments because, of course, the one subject is looking around the room and everybody keeps filling out the form while smoke is coming into the room. And he goes, well, all right, and then keeps filling out the form. And then everybody laughs about it like, yeah, people are so gullible. But really, if it was a real fire in a real room, people wouldn't just be sitting there filling out forms. They'd jump up and then you'd go, okay. So in that sense, we look to others for cues, and there's really good evolutionary reasons why we should do that. Not that we're gullible, but because those are sources of good information.
Indeed. So we know from political science, from the Condorcet-Jury theorem and other mathematical or empirical demonstrations that, as a rule, following the majority is an extremely good heuristic. So as long as people are just even a little bit more likely than chance to get it right on their own, then following what the majority thinks is a very, very good heuristic. And indeed, we see it all across the animal kingdom. Any kind of animal that lives in group is going to follow that heuristic in one way or another. And humans are no different. Indeed, if we have an issue, it's more with ignoring, like putting not enough weight on what the majority thinks or does, rather than too much.
Okay, so little brief stream here on an excellent new book. Came out 2020, Not Born Yesterday, The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe.